guys, welcome back to Mrs. Senesac's classroom. Here to talk to you today about Russian poets. So Russian poetry is very dark in comparison to what we're used to in the US. Russian poetry is heavily influenced by the absurdist genre. So absurdism is the idea that life is kind of bleak and pointless, and so when you read a lot of the poetry, it's pretty dark and discusses kind of like the meaningless of everything, and that the fact that we are alive is kind of absurd because what's the point? So let's talk about some of the famous poets in Russia. Alexander Pushkin is probably one of the most famous of all Russian poets. He's considered to be a national treasure in Russia. He was a man of noble descent. He had a very high education, and he produced a lot and just a ton of work, just volumes of work. Even though he was considered a national treasure, he hated his own writing. Being critical of his own writing actually sent him into exile in the Russian countryside. So even though we have lots of work, he died at 37. So you can imagine what his work would have been like if he had still been alive. Because of the works of Pushkin, Mikhail Lermontov, I apologize to anyone who's actually Russian and can say these names correctly. He actually was heavily influenced by Pushkin and wrote Death of a Poet to commemorate his death, and is also considered a very famous poet and a very influential poet in Russia. Many of his works are set in Caucasus, and they are leaning a little bit more towards the romantic genres of literature and less of the absurdist genre. Nicolai Nekrossov. He was one of the famous poets that wrote Who is Happy in Russia? This explores a lot of the social issues in Russia, and honestly, that is what leads me into the next topic. Is most Russian poetry is actually about the social issues in Russia. There has been a lot going on in their country politically for many years. And as we finish up talking about Russian poetry, I'd like to talk about Anna Kamatova. She had a lot of tragedies and a lot of unfortunate things happened to her throughout her life, and it's all reflected in her poetry, which you'll see throughout all Russian poetry. Her tale is particularly sad because of the political climate and all of the things happening in Russia at that time. Her son and her husband were arrested. Her husband was executed, and her son was sentenced to work in work colonies. So Akamatov's poetry really talks about all of her tragedies. There's so much suffering and sorrow within her poems, and that suffering and sorrow is a very common tone and mood that you will find in Russian poetry. Themes of how people have suffered throughout all the different political regimes, the government repressing the people and not giving them what they need to thrive in their country. Throughout Russia's history, there's lots of revolutions and wars, and those things end up influencing the themes of a lot of poetry. Finally, one takeaway I want you to know about Russian literature is that there are common themes that all share the same idea that humanity, its kindness, chivalry, and love are starting to go away. It's not that there isn't any, but it's slowly decreasing over time. It's decaying. Thank you for watching. If you are interested in more lessons on world literature, stay tuned, because in the coming weeks I plan on creating more lessons like this just for you. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Comment below.